Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Maybe morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the United States. So welcome to everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about managing your closed landfills and how to minimize costs for perpetual care. My name is Sarah Bolton. I'm the new Business Development Manager here at Blue Ridge Services, and I will also be today's webinar moderator. So if you have any questions during the webinar, you can always send me a chat in your control panel. I'll show you where that is here shortly. And you can also email me, Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, at blueridgeservices.com. So before I turn things over to our presenter, I just want to talk about a few technical items to make sure everybody's logged in and able to be set up on their audio correctly. So when you joined the webinar, you probably saw this control panel right here. If you don't see the full control panel, you can always click the little orange arrow and it will expand out. So you're either using audio on your computer with a headset and a microphone, or you've called in through your phone. Just make sure that you have the correct option chosen on your control panel so that your audio matches what you're using. If you guys have questions today, you can send them in through the questions tab on your control panel. And if you have a question about, hey, my audio is not working, or, where can I get the recording after today? You can always send those questions through that tab as well, and I can answer you, or we can address them at the end during our Q&A time. So we will send out a full recording of today's webinar. That way, if you miss any part of it or you want to share with a colleague, you will have a link to the full recording as well as any handouts that we talk about today. This is just for anybody who might be having audio issues. You can always send me a chat or a question and I can try to help you get set up. But it looks like everybody's set up well today. And then if you see a timer in the middle of your screen, sometimes it pops up. You can just click and drag it out of the way with your mouse. Sometimes it shows up, sometimes it doesn't, but just in case it's blocking your view, you can always get it out of the way. All right, so I'm going to pass things over to Troy, who's our presenter today. All right, Troy, so you should have the screen. And I see you on the screen. You're all set.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Greetings, everyone. Appreciate you guys taking the time, or everyone taking the time to join us today. We are going to be talking about managing, closure of landfills and that long-term management practices associated with that, and how to reduce those costs. Get a little background on myself. Been about 25 years of experience in the solid waste, mining, and civil engineering industries, a lot of that in the Superfund and industry as well. So very familiar with those long-term closures, problems that not only the landfill industry has to work with, but also the Superfund groups as well. Started working with Blue Ridge in 1993, been hanging out with these guys off and on for pretty much my entire career. It's a lot of fun, and I enjoy these opportunities to share some knowledge and hopefully help everybody out. I have done landfill work all over North America, and I'm currently in charge of all aerospace management plans for Blue Ridge Services. So that's my particular expertise. So let's talk about closure. The reality is, at some point, every site's going to close. It's just due to regulatory changes, due to site limitations. Everything's going to close, and we got to prepare for that in order to head off any problems down the road. It's not going to go away. As much as we'd like to, that out of sight, out of mind type thing. Well, you do both of those, guess what? You're out of compliance, and then you really got problems. So you can't ignore your closed landfill. But you can, but the results are not going to be positive for anybody, for their environment, for the owner, whatever. It's not good. So we gotta be mindful of that. So let's just start things off with a poll and find out how many closed landfills are you currently responsible for. So I'll let Sarah pull that or get that poll loaded up, and everyone can interact, and we'll get a kind of feel of what everyone's dealing with right now.
All right, great. So I see everybody logging their answers. So this is, you get to pick one answer for this, and your answers are totally anonymous, so nobody can see what you vote. But it is really interesting. We always enjoy kind of seeing the group percentages and who's in the group, and it's always really interesting. So lots of you guys are jumping on there. I love it. I'm going to give a little bit more time if you want to choose an answer. And for anybody who joined us late, welcome. Just to let you know, we will be sending out a full recording from today. So if you missed the first part, or you just want to watch it again, or you have to jump off early, you'll have access to the full recording. All right, so I'm going to just give about a few more seconds. So this is, oops, sorry, if you want to jump in on this. And I'm going to close that out, and I'll share those results. So what we have today, 59% of us, the vast majority, have 1 to 2 closed landfills they're responsible for. Just 4% are responsible for 3 to 5. 15% are responsible for 5 to 12. And then 22% are responsible for 13 or more closed landfills. So it's a pretty interesting breakdown.
Yeah, and it just shows that this is a problem, or it's not a problem. It's just a situation that we're all having to face, and some of us are having to juggle more of these than others. But the thing is how we deal with it applies to all of them. So I think that's a great feel for what everyone's having to deal with down the road. And the thing is as we're doing landfill work, we want to get to the end, and at some point we just want to say, are we ever done? And the reality is, no, because yeah, it's your landfill, and at the end of the day, I know we'd love to just say, hey, it's not my circus, not my monkeys, move on. But the reality is, it is still your circus. You just have less monkeys to deal with. Okay, so it is going to be your issue unless you can change that. And what are some of those issues that we're going to be dealing with? Well, you have the regulatory responsibility, and then you have just the overall liability of owning property and everything that's within it. And then you have the ongoing maintenance and costs associated with that. So the reality is it's a forever type responsibility. Again, having a lot of experience in the Superfund work, talked to British Petroleum. They bought out a very large Atlantic rich field that happened to buy out a bunch of Superfund locations in Montana. Well, BP is still paying to clean those up, and it's been going on 30 years, and it doesn't look to end anytime soon. So that liability stays there constantly. It's not going to go away. We can't leave it behind. So you have to look at other options. Does it belong to somebody else? Can you sell it potentially for, have someone else take on that liability and that responsibility? And then there's the clean closure options where perhaps these older landfills they're maybe not up to Subtitle D compliance or other regulatory or modern regulatory requirements. Maybe you can relocate that waste into a more compliant landfill to where it reduces that liability. So with closure planning, what we want to do is we want to defer those costs as long as we can. And one of the ways that we've done, repeatedly with sites is by stopping, fill by one or more lifts, short of that final grade as we're proceeding through the sites. And what you have to look at is, what is my cost for closure, and then the liability associated with that versus keeping this open for as long as I can while I'm still able to keep operating either in a new area of the landfill or a future expansion area. So you want to kind of compare those costs to see which is going to be best. And ideally, a lot of these sites, you want to kind of close off areas slowly and defer that cost as long as you can, while still also meeting the regulatory requirements. So to do that, we could modify the closure funding schedule based on operational improvements. So if we improve how we're putting in waste, improving the density, reducing the amount of cover soil, all of those things now buy us time to hold off on closing out a section of the landfill. And the other thing that's changing is the industry as a whole, is the reduction in tonnage due to recycling and other factors. So that's another thing that you can take into account. And then filling a forgotten airspace. A lot of times you can go back through and start looking at areas that have settled along, over an older portion of the landfill that's settled, and you can go back and do what we call sliver fills and regain a lot of airspace. You're still meeting your final grades, but it's worthwhile to have it go back through, look at your topos, compare it to your final grades, your permitted grades, and see, well, gosh, we have a whole lot of airspace on this old slope. Maybe we could use this if it hasn't been closed out already. So, got to know the regulations though to do this. You got to stay in compliance. You got to understand what the inspector's looking for, and you got to do your own inspection. Okay, and that's kind of that out of sight, out of mind thing. We can't do that. We gotta be on site. We gotta be doing that inspection. And it's recommended beyond the minimum requirements. That some say, oh, you gotta just fly your site X amount of years, but it's worthwhile to maybe look at it a little more closely and a little more frequently to make sure that there is nothing developing. And then we want to work with the inspectors to improve the site. We don't want to, it's not a head button competition. The end goal is always the same. We want a good, well-maintained, environmentally compliant and safe facility that's closed out. So Subtitle D, for those of us in the United States, everyone's very familiar with that. If we have people from outside of the U.S., it's, I'm sure you're familiar with the compliant issues there, but you got to provide that post-closure care. There's no way around that. And they say it's a minimum of 30 years, more or less, but it's really kind of depending on the protection of human health and environment. So there's ways of if they can ascertain that yes, this is no longer a risk, you can start moving away from that. That final cover maintenance, that's another factor. You got to do it, and we'll get in more into that in a little bit. The leachate collection system, groundwater monitoring, and the landfill gas monitoring. All of those are part of that post-closure care, and that's mandated, federally mandated. And some states even have more stringent requirements. So post-closure costs, what does it cost to maintain a closed landfill? And if you look at North America as a whole, it's almost impossible to come up with a good average because there's so many different variables from site to site, state to state. And so one of the questions that we want to pose to you is how much on average does it cost to maintain your closed landfills? We have a big group here. We have some of you that have 13 or more landfills you're managing. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see what are you guys spending per year to maintain those landfills.
All right, thanks, Troy. So you guys are jumping right in on this. Again, just to let anybody who jumped on late know, these polls are totally anonymous, and it's just an interesting way for us to kind of see where the group is at today. So you don't have to participate if you don't want to, but it is kind of interesting to see this. Also, just to remind everybody, you can send your questions in at any time. So if one comes up, and we're still going through the webinar, you can always just send that question over. I'll kind of keep track of all those. And then we can, if we have any at the end, we'll address them in the Q&A time. All right, so I still see some answers coming in. I'm going to give a little bit more time here in case somebody's thinking through this or crunching some numbers to get this answer. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and share those results. So 18% say they don't really know how much it costs annually. Less or 9% are spending less than $25,000. We have 18% in that $25,000 to $50,000 range, 14, $50,000 to $100,000, and then 41%, so our biggest majority today, are spending more than $100,000 to maintain their closed landfill.
And that's really telling right there in that, I mean, if you think about it, 41% are spending more than $100,000 per year just to maintain their closed landfill. So this isn't just some minor amount. And for those of you that don't know what you're spending on your closed landfills, it just remember, it's impossible to manage something if you don't measure it. So it's worthwhile to actually look at and find out, what are we really spending on this, and is it enough? Is it not enough? So definitely worth looking into. So why are we paying to maintain our landfills? Well, first off, we want to avoid future problems. Okay, it's kind of like preventative maintenance. I mean, that's really what it is. We do it to be responsible, not only to the regulatory requirements, but to the environment as a whole and to our communities that we serve. And we pay to maintain that facility to kind of meet all of that above. But bottom line is we're really paying to stay in compliance. I mean, that's the motivator. We don't want to have those fines and other legal measures taken against us. So that's why we do it. So costs are very site specific. The cost to maintain any closed landfill, it's based in a large part on the site specific conditions such as the climate, depths of fill, age of fill, the types of waste, and operational practices, and then the type of cap. And the cap can be one of the bigger, price items for a closure thing. And so let's talk a little bit about that, because that again can be one of the main cost factors, not only for the installation but then also the long-term maintenance and the costs associated with that. There's obviously a lot of landfill or types of landfill caps. Okay, each provides some benefits and drawbacks, and the goal really when designing a cap and coming up with that is to match it to the landfill as a whole, in order to minimize that environmental risk and the overall cost. I mean, the purpose of a cap, plain and simple, is just to prevent infiltration of water into the waste, thus minimizing the amount of leachate generation. So one of the cap types is the monolithic soil, sometimes referred to as an ET, and that's evapotranspiration. And this can be really beneficial for a site that, say maybe it doesn't have as much moisture, or they have an excess of soil, and they can show that, hey, we can just do this grade to where that water is not going to infiltrate in. Maybe there's enough clay content in it. Okay, and then the geosynthetic grass. This is a fascinating one. Heck, I've considered putting, fake grass in for my lawn. I hate mowing my lawn, but if you think about this, you do your entire cap like this, you never got to mow it, and it's a nearly 100% runoff rate. So yeah, I guess that's an option for you. The geosynthetic clay liners, UCLs, some landfill caps have done that. That's actually me in a picture of the Park County landfill from years ago. The soil was abysmal, a lot of gravels, and very difficult to get enough material to even do the cover portion of the GCL. And it was a great solution that the state allowed for doing a cap. Okay, and then you have the more common, the HDPE caps, and this is actually one that's a study project for a bioreactor landfill, to where they're basically recirculating the leachate to increase decomposition and settlement. So closed or active, both. I mean, the reality is they're both very similar. Okay. Sure, we got some differences, but the things like grading, drainage, illegal dumping, site maintenance, gas controls, leachate, they're all very similar, and they're going to continue on whether the site's active or closed. Okay, it's just in the difference in quantities. So our third poll question, we'll toss this out to you, is kind of get some feedback. What is the most common problem at your closed landfills today?
All right, great. So we have some different options here, and just maybe pick the thing that you have the most issues with or the most challenges with. And again, if this doesn't apply to you, or you can't really figure out an answer, then you don't have to participate. But this is our last poll question of the day. So if you have a burning desire to participate in a poll today, this would be your last chance. So, and just to remind everybody, you can send any questions you have through that questions tab on your control panel. And also, sometimes there's a lot of information we talk about, and sometimes questions might come up afterwards. So you're always welcome to email me, and I can pass that on to whoever would be best suited to answer it. So just keep that in mind. All right, I still see a few answers coming in, so I'm going to give everybody just a few more seconds here if you want to jump in on the poll. And just to remind anybody, I see we had maybe one or two join us in the last few minutes. If you missed the first part of the webinar, we will be sending out the full recording from today, so don't worry about that. You can always go back and review it, or you can share it with a colleague. So we will be sending that out. It usually goes out within a day or two after the webinar. All right, so it looks like everyone has jumped in on this poll question. I'm going to go ahead and close it and share those results. So today, the majority of us, 38%, are dealing with settlement, ponding, drainage, or erosion. 8% have leachate seeps. 25%, the next largest majority, are dealing with leachate or landfill gas hits in the monitoring system. And then 21% vegetation management and wildfire protection, and then 8% vandalism or illegal dumping.
Okay, and these are big problems, and they're not cheap problems to deal with. And so we're going to talk about some of the things in how maybe we can address those, but also to give you some tools to maybe how you can start approaching of solving them at your individual sites. Okay, so this is just a sample, and we pulled this in that, hey, guess what? It's really similar to the polls we just saw. The majority is, you know, are similar with regard to, you know, what you guys are showing. But I think the biggest change that I'm seeing is that there's more of a concern, more of a problem with settlement, ponding, and drainage, whereas on this from a few years ago, in California specifically, it was less of an issue, and the gas monitoring and control was the big one. So, which is the second in our current poll. So just to kind of give you an idea, these are common problems. It really hasn't changed a whole lot over the years, and it's, you know, you're not alone in the things you're dealing with. So we see many of the same issues at closed landfills throughout the country. Okay, and the solutions is we want to do it right. We don't want to only do it one time. So we want dealing with the symptom, you know, versus focusing on the underlying cause, and that's kind of the problem. You obviously have to deal with the symptom, but if you are going to be continually dealing with the symptom if you don't find the underlying cause and address it. Okay, so personality experts say as we get older, we really don't change all that much. We just become more of who we are. Well, for a landfill, that's the same thing. It is as that landfill ages, you're just going to start seeing more and more of a reflection of how it was operationally ran. Okay, and that's just the truth of it. So what you see today is what you're going to have down the road, and we'll go into that, and particularly with the settlement and ponding things. So we just talked, you know, some examples that poor settlement or that settlement issues, it often comes back to that poor compaction or specific waste types that were put in and not put in perhaps the most operationally effective manner. Leachate seeps. That's even though we only had 8%, that's usually a direct result of that excessive cover soil, or that soil is not being harvested back with each new lift, so that there's a barrier between each lift, and so obviously the leachate's got to go somewhere. Landfill gas, either no liner or poor drainage or wet trash. And then, you know, site security. We had some issues where we had, you know, 8% of you are saying we got vandalism and illegal dumping. That's a factor. So those are things we got to think about. A great example of that settlement, you can kind of see this is an old trench fill that there was no compaction done. And if you look, I mean, that's dropped, you know, 6-7 feet potentially, just in that small area, just because, again, it was not operationally placed correctly. And so think about that as you have your active sites. Again, what you're doing today is going to show up down the road in some manner. Okay, ponding. Again, that's a big one. Everyone said settlement and ponding. Yeah, we got leachate seeps. We've all and that green vegetation all versus everything else is brown. It's a good indicator that there's a seep going on. these are common, and that too much soil, like I just mentioned, as you build that layer up, but you don't harvest it back with each new lift, is you're going to start having that transfer of leachate out to the sides, and it just follows that slope out instead of going down to the lower lift. So if you have that situation and you got a closed landfill, so one of the ways, again, we can deal with the symptom, but how do we solve it? So one effective way is to install, go in, excavate out through the layers of soil and down to the lower lifts and install drain rock and then recap it, okay? The other thing is subsurface fires. We didn't have that on the poll question, but that is a factor, and it does still occur. It was much more common in latter years, but it's still a factor here. We actually recently did some work on a site where they had a wildfire roll through. We'll get to the wildfires portion in a bit, but it potentially caused some subsurface fires that we were able to identify using our drones to basically with our thermal cameras to say, hey, you better go check these spots out. There's something going on here. Okay, and that's something, again, when we go back to that monitoring side of things, you may want to go above and beyond what the minimum requirements are. Okay, and so this is just a video of that same spot. I know it looks all red now, but you'll see it in just a second. But this is just that drone where we're going to fly up and we go right to that, and it's a little depression, and there's no question that there's something hotter going on down there. And this was an area where the wildfire just blew through, and what we're thinking is that it lit up some sort, it was able to get through the cap and cause some subsurface smoldering going on. So that, again, there's a lot of tools out there, and that's just one of them, is using that thermal imagery with drones, something that we do pretty regularly. So the other thing is that the second majority of our poll was the leachate or landfill gas hits. Well, we got our landfill gas problems. That is a cost that we have to look at, and how do we deal with it? We also have the wildfire risk, which is going to come back. So we talked about the subsurface, but that landfill gas with wildfire threats, that's a factor. So that was 21% of that vegetation management and wildfire prevention. For those of you who lived in California or know of seeing all the fires going on there, I mean that's a major deal. We have a lot of the landfills that we work for there get impacted by this, and so that's something to kind of keep in mind, is that every landfill is potentially at risk from wildfires, but there's always ways to minimize that risk. And so one of the ways is we want to maintain a really robust fuel break around the landfill. And there's ways of doing that. We want to mow and trim our vegetation, and especially around the landfill gas systems. We obviously want good vegetation cover on our cap areas. That, again, is going to reduce that erosion and kind of protect that cap, but we want to make sure that our gas system is not inundated with that, and we'll show some pictures of why that's important. We want to maintain good site security to prevent trespassing by kids, homeless, vandals, people with 4x4s, motorbikes. They can start tearing things up, and more importantly, that just the hot mufflers, they can start fires. Okay. We want to meet and train with wildfire responders so that they know what systems are at the landfill, such as water supply and landfill gas lines, etc. So landfill susceptibility to wildfires, it is a bigger issue. The very nature of how we site and operate and close landfills is what really makes them very susceptible. And that's kind of due to where we're placing them, and we're usually putting them out in areas that maybe is harder to develop, and the communities then maybe growing up around them, and there's just a lot of factors that we want to, that kind of lend towards there being a target, I guess, for the wildfires. And one of those vulnerable improvements is obviously our gas system. I mean, gas burns, and that methane gas is an issue. Okay, monitoring well networks, drainage facilities, that's all susceptible. Leachate collection systems, they're typically plastics, the HDPEs and such, and those are obviously very susceptible. And then any system located in that buffer or fill areas where vegetation is encouraged. And that's where things come into play with the gas system, especially is again, we want to encourage that vegetation, but just not near these infrastructures that are susceptible. So here's some examples of that vegetation right around those gas systems that if a fire rolls through here, it's in literally direct contact. It's going to have plenty of fuel to get hotter and cause damage to those systems. Whereas this one, you're starting to get a little more separation off to the side, but again, you got a lot of overgrowth in those areas that are going to basically generate higher heat. Well, this is an example of which you can kind of see in the upper left picture, you can see the rings that once held up one of the main headers, and that thing is gone. It burned through. Okay, and so when a wildfire blows through, it's pretty intense, and you can lose your whole system real fast. Okay, so how hot is a wildfire? Well, depending on factors, it can anywhere from 1200 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, if HD pipe melts at less than 300 degrees Fahrenheit, it doesn't take a whole lot of fuel around that gas line to destroy it. Okay, and then you add in that the flash point of methane is 306 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, you got an invitation for some pretty big flames going on. So one of the ways we're going to deal with that, again, because we're looking at that long-term cost. Okay, so if you have a fire roll through here, even if it's not a big forest fire, say a spark from somebody outside the landfill, they drop a cigarette, burns through, it's much easier to go back through and revegetate that landfill than redo your entire gas system. So this preventative measure is important. So again, we're looking at costs and how do we reduce those and how do we minimize them. And so one of the ways is that mastication. So we want to increase that number of fuel breaks that are created to kind of prevent that fire from jumping, and that's a series of roads or just keeping vegetation minimal. The beauty of mastication is it's eco-friendly. It's a mulch layer. It's low impact on the soil. It's erosion resistant. It's visually appealing, and it requires no rehab. So in areas where they have high brush or real fast developing brush, this is a great solution for you. Other methods could include herbicides or prescribed controlled fires, but those have risks associated with it, in terms of contamination, dead biomass, which dried vegetation is a great fuel. And so then that poses a risk of wildfire, and then it creates neighborhood concerns. I mean, we're still dealing with the public, especially as urban sprawl moves neighborhoods closer to these closed landfills that used to be way out in the boonies. Okay, so that's another factor we have to keep in mind. So site security, even though it was less of an issue, the vandalism or illegal dumping, security has a lot of benefits with regard to the fire prevention, obviously the vandalism and illegal dumping, but just overall in protecting the site as a whole. So we want to limit our liability for unauthorized persons on the site from being injured. Okay, and we want to reduce the risk of CAP or the landfill gas system and other site infrastructures being damaged. Okay, because people being allowed to tool around, it's just an invitation for things to get broke. Okay, so keeping your site secure is a critical thing, and so don't neglect that. Illegal dumping, we all understand that was a factor. It happens. It's getting less and less, thankfully. I think the society as a whole is coming around to seeing that that's not a good thing to do, and so having remote dump sites, drop-off sites has definitely helped, but it's still a factor in some locations. It is a common problem though at the closed landfills, and one way of reducing that is to eliminate the historical entrance. So when people get into a habit, I mean, humans are just notorious for just staying habitual in their behaviors. If you eliminate that historic entrance, remove the driveway, replace a gate with a fence, and effectively remove all evidence of that historical landfill entrance, that actually helps quite a bit. And then you develop an access to another point that's not, was not common for the end user. So erosion was obviously a big one on our poll question, and we deal with this a lot. And one of the biggest things is just being able to get the vegetation established in some of these sites. And if we're not able to do that fast enough, then obviously we start having problems, and it compromises the cap. It invites a whole series of problems. So, even with vegetation established, if you're not maintaining it, if you're allowing depressions to develop and water to channelize, then it's again going to open that opportunity for erosion to occur. And then the other factor that comes in that can contribute to the erosion, excuse me, is just the bulky waste factor. Stuff that's put in the landfills over, decades and decades, and it works its way to the top, just the way that settlement occurs. And so you'll start having protrusions of these, big bulky waste items. And if you're not doing that monitoring, you're not going to identify that until it's already, penetrated up through the cap and start having factors of creating erosion and other issues. Okay. We then obviously have the costs associated and the importance of our monitoring networks for both gas and groundwater. But what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for that ideal, closed, well vegetated, well functioning, monitoring systems to where the site maintenance is minimal and it prevents those long-term big cost issues that can develop. So for closed sites, we want to kind of mention it earlier, and we want to bounce back to it is we want to fix the problem once the right way. And in order to do that, we got to communicate, and we got to communicate with the regulator to find out what is the best way for them, for us to solve the problems, and working with them so that they're in agreement with it. The goal is to solve that current problem, limit our long-term issues, and then minimize liability, and then reduce our cost of post-closure maintenance. So pre-closure activities is a way we can start addressing that. We want to mitigate the types of problems that are common at your closed landfills through that. So consider how a current issue at your active landfill will affect post-closure. We've talked about the operational, how important that is. Are we operationally doing things in our current landfill to prevent those long-term problems down the road and the costs associated with that? And we mentioned it, the leachate seeps, the settlement, the landfill gas, the illegal dumping. Okay. So it starts here. I mean, it starts on that daily operations, and we build up from there. It's always the small steps that have the biggest impacts. And so just even how we're doing the daily cells and placing our waste can have a tremendous long-term impact on that landfill after it's closed and done. Okay. So to do this, what's recommended is we want to brainstorm. Okay, we got a team, we got good people, and when I say we, it's all of us on this conference. We got people that we work with, and we want to look at the kind of a cause and effect diagram. We call it or it's not we, but it's very commonly known as a fishbone diagram. And what we can look at is, so let's look at what these common issues for closed landfills are. Okay, so for example, our poll questions, I mean, we had settlement and ponding and drainage and erosion control. Well, we got that. And, we got leachate seeps. So you got site maintenance, you got litter control, landfill gas controls, grading of fill surfaces, drainage and erosion, leachate control, site security, final cover. So so you make that list of these are common issues. And then you want to identify, okay, what is my problem? What is my site? And you may have multiples, and you can do this for each one. And so what you can do is look at, okay, we have a problem of, say, illegal dumping or vandalism, okay? And even though that was low on our poll, that's the one I used for the example. So I'm going to say, hey, it's site security is an issue right now. How do we solve this? And what you do is you look at, okay, what are some things that are causing this to be a problem for us? And more importantly, we know it's a problem. What are some possible solutions for us, and how would they help us? Well, what you can look at, you can just start brainstorming. It's like, well, we can change our access point, or if we can't change our access point, how do we modify our access point to limit people's abilities to get in? Okay, we have perimeter fencing. Well, some sites they just got a standard 5-strand barbed wire, fence around their site. Well, that doesn't do a whole lot other than keep cows out. Okay, so maybe you need more security-minded fencing. Perhaps surveillance is something to look into. Cameras that can be accessed from another facility that, so you don't have to have someone on site, but someone can at least kind of keep an idea of hey, what's going on out there. And then, we got a lack of enforcement. How can we implement enforcement measures for people that are caught out there? Okay. So those are the ways of brainstorming to where you can start identifying each individual problem, and then by doing those small little steps, you can start reducing the cost associated with that problem. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. Open this up to questions or comments. If you don't have any here, you are welcome to email us, and one of us on the Blue Ridge Services team will get back to you one way or the other. I appreciate everyone's time today. I hope this was beneficial to everyone. So we'll turn this back over to Sarah.
All right. Thank you so much, Troy. And I apologize to everyone who I forgot to close out the poll window. So for a moment, we were just looking at poll results. So I apologize for that. We will go back through and we can insert in the slides before we send out that recording, so you guys can take a look at those, any that you missed. I don't see any questions coming in. So like Troy said, you can always send those to us after the fact. My email is sarah, S-A-R-A-H, at blueridgeservices.com, and I can forward those on to Troy or whoever else on our team might be a good fit to answer those. So thank you guys all for joining us today. And Troy, unless you have something else to say, we can wrap up.
I just appreciate everyone's time, and hope everyone has a great rest of the week.
All right. Thanks, everyone.